As it happens, my lecture will be about Notre-Dame de Paris and caricatures, and I'm going to try to be presenting you with the caricature of a French people trying to read out a text in English. And yes, thank you for the translation of my text. Thank you. On April the 15th, 2019, as the flame ravaged Notre-Dame de Paris Cathedral, quotes from the eponymous novel flood social media, in particular the ones evoking, and I quote, a large flame which rose between the two bell towers with swirls of sparks. Media coverage of the fire is almost worldwide, from Japan to Turkey, from Italy to the United States, from Qatar to Canada, from China to Brazil. Millions of viewers hear the name of the cathedral pronounced in a multitude of accents. But what is most surprising is the number of cartoons that refer, on this occasion, to the novel by Victor Hugo, The Cathedral, being indissolubly linked to the writer. As you will see, very often their productions are inspired by the animated feature film produced by Disney Studio, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, released in 1996, and of course, it's Quasimodo, such as Victor Hugo intended, which catches the attention of the cartoonist. I quote, a big head, bristling with head hair, between the two shoulders a huge bump, monstrous hands, and as well as this deformity, a somewhat formidable appearance of vigor and courage. In front of Notre Dame in flames, this archetype of deformity, under the pen of the cartoonist, cannot hold back his tears. Here is some illustration among many others. That by Arkadiusz Kazimierz Polonia. By Gilgamesh, Turkey. By Denis de Geest, Inside. By Zies, France. By B. Dufrance with this play on the word Notre Dame, which becomes Notre Drame. By Omar Abdoulat, Jordan. By Yves Descaries, Quebec. By Amber Wade, France. Unsigned. By Tiago Seguet, Brazil. By Y, pseudonym of Yannick Lernet, Quebec. By Hassan Beblay, Lebanon, we from Quasimodo becomes Quasimondo, thus accentuating the universality of the drama. The fate of the Hunchback of Notre Dame also captures the attention of several cartoonists. Quasimodo, who, as writes Victor Hugo, was animated by a passion for pearling the bells, finds himself unemployed, no longer able, I quote the text again, to animate the seat singers to speech and gesture like a conductor spurring of intelligent virtuosos. This can be found, for example, in the drawing by Zachnik, France, where Quasimodo solicits the generosity of passers-by using a small sign with an approximate spelling. And for Giuseppe Lamicla, Italy, he turns him into a homeless man living, tears in his eyes, with his bundle over his shoulder. The drawing by Yelch, France, is in the same vein. Unemployed, Quasimodo's only option is to call, to call 115, the social assistant emergency number. The tones sometimes differ when Quasimodo ponders about the slow progress of the reconstruction work of the cathedral or criticizes it. Thus, Jelsch, France, depicts him cutting a piece of migre. Only Sergei Elkin, a Russian cartoonist, is optimistic. It's a determinate Quasimodo that he offers. The future tense will restore is much punchley. Other drawings are more imaginative. Thus, this one signed by Vicky, pseudonym of several cartoonists, which does not allow us to know their nationality, shows Quasimodo showing his gratitude to the firefighters. That of Osama Ayay Jordan could refer to reader of the novel to chapter 3 of the fourth book. Under a bell tower was seen an enormous head and a bunch of disorderly limbs swinging furiously at the end of a rope. A single word uttered by Quasimodo, sanctuary, evidently recalls the moment when he abducts, I quote Hugo, the Egyptians with one hand, like a childish doll, and with a single redundant monument into the church, lifting the maiden above his head and shouting in a formidable voice, Asylum. Chonu, Norman cartoonist for the West de France newspaper, captures the moment where the spy collapses into the fire, showing Quasimodo's concern, desperately searching for Esmeralda. The heroine of the novel, in tears against a background of fire, is Martina Assaya Choi's, Italy. Her distress is that of all the witnesses to the fire. Only two drawings bring together the two heroes of the novel. One is signed David Gilson, France, for whom the cathedral brings Esmeralda and Quasimodo together. The second, by Marc Lange, France, represents Quasimodo in tears, embracing Esmeralda as if to protect her from the flames and the smoke. Other artists were inspired by the musical by Plamondon and Cochiante, performed for the first time in Paris in 1998. Thus, Damien Guis, a dual French and Burkina Faso national, makes fun of African head of state. We complete in haste to express the support for the French people with a cover version of the song Belle, which was a wonder-wide success, interpreted by Garou, Daniel Lavoie, and Patrick Fiori. The Times of the Cathedral, another song from the musical, interpreted by the Quebecer Bruno Pelletier, is found under the pen of Jacques Post, France, and Olivier Pernet, Belgium, under the assumed name of Oli, used sing artistically songs with the line of the song. Two caricaturists, I would want them to say only two, prefer to depict Victor Hugo himself rather than his hero, near the burning cathedral. Inspired by a photograph taken in Paris in September in 1964 by Valéry, Nicolas Vado, a Franco-British Australian artist, draws him in tears at the spy built by Viollet-le-Duc and inaugurated in August 1859, collapse. Creator of many puppets of the Guignol de l'Info, Canal+, Bernard Marty brings back the tradition of sort of the comparative characters of Victor Hugo, who turned him into a wicked character. He descends from the sky, and his own tears fail to put out the gigantic blaze of the cathedral. I will compare to say of his cathedral. Dozens and dozens of caricatures of captured scenes from the 19th century indeed associate Notre-Dame de Paris with Victor Hugo. When artists conjure up the work of the writer, one can be certain that Notre-Dame de Paris is mentioned. It is indeed for them one of the major works of Victor Hugo. Thus, this famous caricature by Daumier, which appeared in the Charivari of July the 20th, 1849, shows Deputy Hugo perched on a pedestal with its highest and widest degree resting on the edge of Notre-Dame de Paris, above three other eligible titles. At the time of the return of Hernani in Paris, Adrien turns Victor Hugo in Le Masque in August the 27th, 1866, into a puppeteer who pulled the string of the figurine of Bressan, who plays the role of Don Carlos. The playwright stands on a pile of books, among which the novel which concerns us is at the first level. Pilotel, for a lithograph published in February 1871, imagines that the balloon Victor Hugo can rise thanks to his works throughout over the nacelle. Notre-Dame de Paris is one of the books having landed on the ground. When Amand Vacher draws for a museum of famous men in 1876, Victor Hugo in Majesty, he surrounds him with a dozen of his works, including Les Misérables and Notre-Dame de Paris. An anonymous sketch from 1877 showing the head of Victor Hugo, surrounded by rays, being prized by Paul Meurice and Auguste Vacry, claiming the 10 degrees which separate them from the living God, the last step referring to the novel. This is not from a newspaper, but a dish made in Belgium around 1880 by the Bock brothers, which use a well-known caricature by André Gilles that appears in Les Hommes d'Aujourd'hui. The title, Notre-Dame de Paris, one amongst 22 others, is inserted between Les Burgraves et Le Rhin. 50 years after its publication, the novel is not forgotten. Sometimes the cartoonist does not just mention the title Notre-Dame de Paris, he associated it with a character from the novel. Thus, not without risk of censorship or prohibition of his newspaper, Marcellin draws the Journal pour Rire of September the 10th, 1853, Victor Hugo alongside George Sand, Eugène Sue, Balzac and Dumas, and below him, Quasimodo, ringing a bell between the tower of the cathedral. 2 pages later, Marcellin depicts, by satirizing them, some of the heroes of this novelist. For Notre-Dame de Paris, it chose Esmeralda, a dancer on point that pulls along a toy on wheels, a little goat, who beats a tambourine, Phoebus, who curls his mustache and whose breastplate has been hit by a torero, and Quasimodo, who offers her heart crown with flame to Esmeralda, who prefers to turn her gaze toward Phoebus. The same Marcellin manifests again an interest in Notre-Dame de Paris in an issue of L'Espiègle, post-1866, pardoning engravings representing Mangin, the famous Parisian film flammer selling pencil. He turns Victor Hugo, flanked by Gavroche on his right, and Esmeralda and her goat on his left, into a seller of his own works, whose title appears on a banner. Notre-Dame de Paris is on the second line. Is it an American magazine, Harper's Weekly, April the 4th, 1864, which offers us a third example. Paying homage to Victor Hugo, Carlo Grip recounts his literary career in several small character scenes, and it's Quasimodo, perched on the tower of the cathedral, which holds the title Notre-Dame de Paris, is to pull it above the other novels. More surprising, this plate from the série Les Contemporains dans leur assiette, signed Alfred Le Petit, published in the end of 1870 and encouraged by Victor Hugo himself, we thought, I quote, the idea ingenious. From the head of the novelist, turned into an oil lamp, radiate numerous rays, some of which quote the title of a work by the writer. Notre-Dame de Paris is on the longest radius, on the right-hand side, at 3 o'clock, as they say in military jargon. Below, we recognize from right to left the cathedral, Quasimodo, separated from Esmeralda by her goat, by Jean Valjean, and Phoebus, with lance leveling on the shoulder of the Bohemian. Very rare are the caricatural scenes where heroes of Notre-Dame de Paris appear without the title of the novel, which does not prevent the reader from identifying them. I know only of 3. Such as is done by Cham or Cam, published in L'Almanach pour Rire, where I quote the caption, the gallery slave Jean Valjean creeps among Victor Hugo's character to show off poor Quasimodo. And this other from Lilo, pseudonym of Lemo, we 2 days after Victor Hugo's death, offered on May the 24th, 1885, to the reader of Triboulet, a satirical monarchist newspaper. I repeat the caption again, the homage of its children. We recognize on the left, in the middle of character from his play, Esmeralda holding its tambourine. Or the letter by unknown author, and an equally unknown date, which represents Victor Hugo, bird so later than 1861, holding Quasimodo and in his left hand, and under his right arm, probably Esmeralda. A very, very, very poor quality. A legend shows the tower here. Shows the tower of the cathedral between Quasimodo and Esmeralda. On the other hand, many caricatures bring closer together, sometimes intimately, Victor Hugo and the Cathedral of Paris. Benjamin Rigaud is, it seems, the first caricatures to associate the writer with the cathedral, 5 years after the publication of the novel, in an issue of the Charivari, dated the 12th of October, 1836. Inspired by a painting by Auguste de Châtillon, he captioned his drawing, Monsieur Victor Hugo, the strongest romantic head, and remind in the annotations that he was the author of Notre-Dame de Paris and Les Orientales. In the background, in the left, the very distinctive tower loom. The publication of this advertising brochure by an unknown author for a periodic publication by Derneville was not authorized by the authorities in January 1844. Victor Hugo, seated on the dome of the Institute, can make predictions thanks to his telescope. All around him, a Parisian decor, with in particular the Vendôme and July column, Place de la Bastille, and dominating the whole scene, the powerful towers of the cathedral. Nadar is the only categories we, in 1844, in a publication entitled Six Portraits par Nadar, dares to represent Victor Hugo leaving Paris into exile, symbolized by a rock on the left. We recognize on the right, dominating other building, the Cathedral of Paris. Around 1866, Hippolyte Mailly, photographer and lithographer, proposed, faithful to the tradition on the big head, this humorous drawing, which could be a note of the end of the toilet of the sea, when the hero Gilliatt is seated on a rock that the sea will be soon cover. Does Hippolyte Mailly want to recall, 35 years after the publication of Notre-Dame de Paris, that Victor Hugo is its author, by drawing the two towers of the cathedral in the background. In December 1869, the Guernsey exile received a drawing by Pilotel, no doubt inspired by Hieronymus Bosch, and he records in its notebook, I read of a beautiful drawing by Pilotel, which represents me, surrounded by envious people and untitled hell, a kind of spectre in the present time. Two Parisian monuments are identifiable, the Institut de France, in front of which we recognize Émile Littré, the author of a famous dictionary, and Victor Hugo, very close to the Parisian Cathedral. At the time of the legislative election in February 1871, Quillembois raised a caricature he has produced from the newspaper La Mode in August 1850. He had the most violent comment, Victor Hugo only has affection for assassins, but he retains the towers of Notre-Dame de Paris, the only recognizable monument which the poet flies over like a witch astride on a kazoo. It's more an allegory than a caricature than Faustin published in Chroniques Illustrées from May 26, 1972. Victor Hugo holds on his hand his collection of poems, L'Année Terrible, recounting the year 1870-1871, which saw the defeat of France against Prussia and the uprising of the Commune. Three monuments testified to the fire or attempted fires of which they were victims. On the left, the Julie column, on the right, the Panthéon, and between the two, Notre-Dame Cathedral. An astonished composition that Henri Destouches produced shortly after the death of Victor Hugo. The letter spent in eyes everything it touches. Theatre Masque on the left, Toad and Donkey in the center, which refer to a poem from La Légende des siècles, victim of châtiment, among which we recognize on the right Napoleon III and Parisian monuments in the upper. I don't think the Toad and Donkey are the people of Jersey and Guernsey. In the right corner, the Julie Canon, the Panthéon, and once more, Notre-Dame de Paris. Victor Hugo is indeed, as the title suggests, the great illuminator. The poster by Jules Chéret, contemporary with the previous drawing, which announced the opening of the Musée Grévin, of a gallery celebrating the apostasy of Victor Hugo, presents only one recognizable monument, Notre-Dame Cathedral. It's not the Parisian monument that it evokes, but the novel by Victor Hugo, Jules Chéret having drawn above one of the two towers Esmeralda and a hunting goat. We could include numerous scenes of this nature. My time is running out, so let's select the caricature of Henriot, pseudonym Henri Maigret, published in the Journal Amusant. Imagining the Universal Exhibition of 1900, he captioned his drawing as follows. Le Palais des Lettres will have Victor Hugo as the central dome illuminated at night. All around will feature the retrospective rooms or monuments. We obviously recognize to the left, above the room, an emblematic retrospective monument, the Cathedral of Paris. I have saved to conclude this presentation a few caricatures we associate the writer even more closely with Notre Dame. Shortly after the publication of the novel, this small bust, perhaps executed by Tétart, shows Victor Hugo topped with the tower of the cathedral. around the wooden cylinder on which he is resting, there's 3 verses. One day, brow heavy with dreamy sadness, standing on Notre Dame, he contemplates Lutèce. He evokes the dead we passed before his eyes. Then he dropped from the top of the twin towers, colossal granite pages like them, handwritten in the heavens. This caricature of unknown author and date is obviously linked to the previous one, not only by Victor Hugo's astonishing hairstyle, but also by the poem that accompanies it, an acrostic poem. You know, each verse is beginning by the letter of Victor Hugo. But Dinah, here, d'accord. I greatly admire the translation by Dinah of the acrostic poem because she has succeeded to keep the acrostics in English version. Splendid. I read the poem by Dinah. Victor Hugo, crowned by Notre Dame towers, ingenious towers with them over its reader, clearly of our great writer is the leader. This as much for his Caesarus as for his plot dark powers. Of L'Homme we have read Marion, flower of blood and honey, Ruy Blas, Le Roi s'amuse, and his Cromwells on the money, Hernani Borgia, that monster of history, universal thinker, so profound and full of mystery, giant of a writer, they say, we shall believe anything he says. Oh, alive he was revered, now he's dead, imagine the price. Thank you, Dinah. Oui, yes. Yeah. On this caricature scene of Granville, published in December 1839 in La Caricature and entitled Grande course au clocher académique, is still capped by the cathedral, like a bishop rowing his mitre, acclaimed by Thierry Ferrer. He awaits his election notably in his company of Vigny, Dumas, Balzac, and Nerval. Undoubtedly, this caricature by Benjamin Roubaud, published in Le Charivari in 1841, is one of the best known. Sitting on his publication with his feet resting on Parisian monuments and leaning against Notre Dame, the novel was published 10 years earlier, Victor Hugo, pensive, looks at the money brought to him in a chest by sewn figures. The caricature by Gustave Deray, published in Le Journal pour Rire, shows him carrying Notre Dame Cathedral not on his head, but under his arm, while Anne-Marie, clinging to his clothes, hand him bags filled with écus, allusion to the immense success of the 13th edition between 31 and 53. In 1863, André Gide, a friend of Victor Hugo, had a surprise in store for readers of his parody of Chanson des rues et des bois, which he called Chanson des grues et des bois, by not drawing the poet with the beard he has been wearing for several years, but, to use his expression, the silhouette of times past that he had at the time Notre Dame de Paris was published. A very broad forehead and abundant hair, he leans on a gigantic quill and carries the cathedral under his arm. It's a double page of the newspaper Le Géant in April 1868, that Henri Meyer offers to his readers a portrait of the writer, perhaps inspired by an illustration of the Gargantua, illustrated by Gustave Gorey in 1854. We could use Rabelais' sentence to caption Meyer's scene. He was seen by everyone in great admiration. Serene, relaxed, arms resting on the tower, Victor Hugo seemed at home, sit on the cathedral. Under Luke's pen, Victor Hugo, allegory of the classic poet, plays a lyre whose shape recalls the two towers of the nearby cathedral. Readers of the Monde Parisien, supplément of November 1825, maybe inspired by a photograph taken by Nada a few years later. For the inauguration of a Victor Hugo museum and the revival of the adaptation of Notre-Dame de Paris, Collignon and Tocqueville wrote the initiator of the project, Hilarion Balande, director of the Théâtre des Nations, Place du Châtelet in Paris, seated between the twin towers as Henri Meyer had done for Victor Hugo. In a similar position that Fernand Sabaté chose to announce the Hugo Fields Christmas tree in December, and which is inspired as regards the position of the arms by Rodin's project. More than 70 years later, the publication of this novel, Victor Hugo remains for many cartoonists, caricaturists or not, the author of Notre-Dame de Paris. I shall end with three caricatures which are somewhat different to those we have already seen. Daumier was the only artist to choose to base a scene of a sentence from the book. In Charivari, in 1840, he depicts a bourgeois pulling a face when he finds an hair in his soup. The caption, "Hey, ho, my hostess, like my soup bald," is an allusion to Jean Frollo, the archdeacon's brother, who finds an hair in an omelette and says to the tavern keeper, "I like my omelettes bald." Jam, or Cam, whose caricature Victor Hugo collected, asks the reader of Charivari to compare Les Misérables, which was being read for publication, to Notre-Dame de Paris. In his opinion, judging by the caption he provides, Les Misérables in general are being elevated to the height of Notre-Dame de Paris, a notion supported by the image in the right-hand side of the composition, where we can see that the tip of the quill held aloft by Victor Hugo does indeed reach the height of the cathedral. Victor Hugo is once again an inspiration for André Gide in a famous caricature published in L'Eclipse. It shows Auguste Vacquerie, one of Victor Hugo's most faithful admirers, as an incense bearer. Sorry. Kneeling before the cathedral, its facade makes the H of Hugo. The caption refers to a poem by Vacquerie, featured in his recently published collection Mes années de jeunesse à Paris. It is worth quoting the poem's last line: "The towers of Notre Dame made the H of his name." This is Victor Hugo's bookplate designed in 1870 by Aglaïus Bouven. Victor Hugo was very pleased with it. "I am charmed by the bookplate you have done for me," and it's a bookplate that serves as a backdrop to the two statements which bring me my lecture to end. The first by Michelet. I quote, "I wanted to talk about Victor Hugo Notre-Dame de Paris, but some lion has used his claw to score such a deep mark on this great building that nobody dares touch it. It's a thing from now on. It's its fief, it's Quasimodo fief, feudal inheritance." The second is for Victor Hugo himself, by Victor Hugo himself, sorry. On the 14th November 1873, he recorded in his notebook the word of his grandson, Georges, who was 5 years old at this time, and who was on his way back from a walk in the Jardin des Plantes. As he was passing Notre Dame, Georges said, "Papa's towers." Thank you.